Astras.
Oh, excellent. Okay. Thanks. Sorry. I was wondering what precisely to present today. And I mean, I think that is a luxury problem because we have a rich oeuvre of works to present. So I decided to just quickly say something, sort of a recap, a sort of general recap of the project, the basic objectives of the projects, and then try to say something more about the orientation. It's not shifting. No. So we started out with the idea of the general orientation of the EU3D project as examining the conditions under which differentiation is conducive to dominance, and to spell out the conditions also under which differentiation is conducive to democracy. So that's basically the main purpose of the project, and we have approached that through historical analysis, and you will hear more about this. We have looked at this also comparatively, both in terms of analyzing federal states and the regional organizations. We've looked at this in terms of the internal dynamics of the EU, and we've also looked at this in terms of EU external relations. So I think we covered all of this, sort of the main relevant dimensions. And then we are also approaching this more conceptually, as we're doing in this panel. The first point is to examine the very understanding of differentiation. I can talk about this. So I have constructed then a sort of a standard notion of differentiated integration from some of the bodies of the literature. That is that there is a sort of minimum common denominator, that it is about deviations in EU law or areas where not all member states are covered by EU law. Basically, this is Arbelli and Daniel Thum's definition of differentiated integration. So I call that sort of the main or dominant account of differentiated integration. And then I want to query to what extent is this adequate for understanding questions of domination and democracy and the relationship between them. Obviously, this has already been debated, and it brings up a number of important issues, both for domination and democracy. It speaks about forms of exclusion and inequality, unequal treatment, and so on. So certainly it resonates with these other two themes. Now, next please. What I still think is that it doesn't give us enough purchase to get to the core issues of democracy and domination, simply relating to differentiated integration. That is an established debate, and the question is, to what extent does that mainstream debate on or notion of differentiated integration cover and address current challenges that the European Union is facing? So that's sort of the notion, and I don't think it gets to the core of some of the issues of domination and democracy. For that, we need a broader understanding of differentiation. And that's why I go back to what I call the classical notion of differentiation as a form of specialization, role, functional, and institutional specialization. This is the Parsonian, Durkheimian, and so on understanding of differentiation. So this is a much more macro-sociological understanding of differentiation. And the point is that all political systems, of course, are differentiated in this way, and modernization entails a form of differentiation. The Parsons was criticized for assuming that this would be ongoing the whole time into more and more specialized roles. But there is an important insight in this, in that type of specialization. And with that also comes the question of biases. When you develop a new political system, to what extent does it embed certain types of biases that can be pathological in that sense? So that's what I think is valuable in this mainstream account of differentiation, because it provides you with a clearer sense of the infrastructure of political systems that you then can think about differentiated integration in relation to. And I also think that this is what I said already. If you can go on to the next one too. So that's, yes, okay. So that's the question now is the notion of differentiation discipline or theory specific? And my answer is yes. So I'm saying that we can identify several so-called worlds. I'm using Luke's in a more loose way of talking about worlds instead of phases. You could also use phases, but I think that they are based on quite different understanding of the European Union, or presupposes underlying notions of the European Union that are quite different. In that sense, I call them worlds. So we start with the next one. That's the world of law. Now, the mainstream account of differentiated integration, and it might be a straw man, but I'm saying that basically it's concerned with DI as deviations from EU primary and secondary law, and that the challenges are therefore much internal to EU law. And I think still the challenges that the EU faces today are more profound because they are pertaining to the constitutional status and the role of EU law within the larger EU multi-level polity. We have the issue of constitutional ambiguity. This is incidentally something that Neil Walker wrote very nicely about in 1998. But that was before the financial crisis and a number of other challenges, sort of a shifting of center of gravity towards more intergovernmental organizations and so on. So I think the challenges currently facing the European Union are more profound than they were in that sense in 1998. Similarly, you had the rejection of the constitutional treaty, and with the Treaty of Lisbon, it's more uncertain what kind of constitutional status the EU has, because it's argued that the constitutional track has been abandoned. So, I mean, what exactly is the constitutional status of EU law in this sense? And then you also have the issue of who should set the terms of differentiation. So the constitutional uncertainty is who actually establishes how we should have differentiation in Europe. Is it still the member states determining this through treaties, or is it the EU legal system that sets the terms, or is this an ongoing wrangle between them? So that in itself is one of the problematic aspects, and it also depends on where you sit, because if you adopt like more federal perspective, you would have an objective at least to have a more hierarchical system. But if you take on a more legal pluralist perspective, then it is a question of working out the compatibility between different legal systems, which is it's a heteronomous system then. And then, of course, the question is, how heteronomous can you be? Is it a dual system, or can it be three systems when you are starting to have differentiated systems? So for law, this is a big problem, because you have to have the final arbiter and the final decider of the law in that sense. So this has to be worked out. We also have conflict of laws, as Christian Jørges has been writing about. The fact that monetary policy is set at the European Union level and welfare policies are set at the national level. That's a diagonal conflict that is the problem. So you have an ongoing issue of conflicts of law in this. So I think those are sources of differentiation in Europe. They give impetus to states demanding differences and so on. So that has to do with the basic structure. And then also, how compatible are the legal systems? And that has to do with built-in biases, because if we discuss differentiation at the Union level in terms of deviations from EU law, we need to go back and refer to what extent EU law itself is in sync with or not from what is happening in the member states. To what extent are these compatible in spirit, so to speak, so that it can work out a viable interaction? So I think these types of incompatibilities are what I would encourage us to focus on in terms of understanding differentiation from the perspective of the world of law, rather than simply confining the analysis to what happens and in relation to the EU law. So it's a broader, multi-level kind of dynamic in that sense. Okay, the next is what I call world of power and interest, and that's basically intergovernmentalism. And I think it makes an important contribution in discussing differentiated integration in relation to states, their powers and interests. And there is, and underlines that there is a specific structure of demand and supply of this. But I also see that the analysis that are claiming to be intergovernmental are relying on other theoretical perspectives. So the question is, does intergovernmentalism extend far enough? Or might not the EU be already developed beyond intergovernmentalism so that you cannot simply rely on an intergovernmental perspective to understand these types of dynamics? And there's the other presumption in intergovernmentalism, namely that the EU is a subset of the world. And it assumes a basic compatibility. But then I think the focus should also be on rule shirking and asymmetrical power relations and manipulation that you find in the international realm. So more brute power politics, and to what extent we find that in the European Union, rather than simply confining the discussion on intergovernmentalism to a question of relating to established EU laws, to what extent states manage to get through on demands for exemptions from the established law. The whole question of is how attentive to, how loyal to law are states in their actions. To what extent are they undermining and developing informal mechanisms of power relations rather than. So I think that also is an important agenda where we therefore should carve out more space for domination in relation to this, and just look at the sources of differentiation in relation more to power relations. The shift of gravity towards the European Council, to me, clearly manifests such a development, because the European Council is a bargaining body, and it shirks rules and so on. So that the shift of gravity in the EU itself seems to me to warrant that type of focus, and I would encourage intergovernmentalists to push more that type of agenda. And then finally, this is what I call the world of institutions. Here I have borrowed from Martin Olsen, basically, on the idea of appropriateness. And that institutions are carriers of logics of appropriateness. So this is something, this I think is an analytical framework that would help us to understand something about the basic institutional infrastructure of political systems. That you have different conceptions of appropriateness embedded in civilizations, in basic cultural systems, in nation states, as well as in specific organizational fields, as well as in specific institutions. Of course, this is an extremely unwieldy idea, but I think there is a hierarchy in this, and if we embed this more clearly, this notion more clearly in law, I think we get a clearer sense of the basic norms and rules that govern modern societies, so that there are commonalities under the heading of appropriateness. And then the question is how to navigate these versus the inevitable cultural and other types of differences that we find. So I think this perspective itself is also pregnant to provide us with an understanding of the sort of institutional infrastructure. And in that is my plea is that the EU has a distinct differentiation configuration. And the question, of course, is to what extent is that in sync with those of the member states? I mean, the core constitutional principles of the member states are the key sources of appropriateness, if you use the Martin Olsen terminology. And to what extent is the EU embedded in such a manner that it is in sync with these kind of principles? That is a way of helping us to understand something about the congruence or divergence between different levels in the EU. So as a kind of a benchmark, these kinds of key constitutional principles would be one way of approaching this. So therefore, embedding appropriateness more in not only in political institutions, but also in law as one way of doing it, and then looking at, okay, what are the processes of transfer between the member states and the EU, and vice versa, the bottom-up and top-down Europeanization dynamics. What kind of both pathological but also democracy-enhancing dynamics do we get from these types of interaction? And this is not only about power, but it's also about learning, copying, emulation, and so forth, these types of dynamics. And whether there is a basic convergence or divergence, basically. So there are also domination aspects, but much more structural forms of domination embedded in this. So the question then is how to combine these. One could think about these as different analytical perspectives to understand the European Union, or one can try to combine it. I think you can combine them. If you start out with the idea that the European Union has a distinct differentiation configuration, then you can tap into and see, okay, what does it entail for law? What does it entail for power politics? And what kinds of appropriateness are we actually finding in this? So I think it is possible to combine this into a more coherent framework so that we don't need to discuss the whole EU3D question from 3 separate analytical vantage points only, but that it actually can be combined in a more coherent manner. As part of that, this whole differentiation configuration also is the need to think much more systematically about representation, and that representation is systemic, and that's exactly what Dario and Castiglione will be talking about today. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So we now have Dario, who's going to be talking about disconnect in representation. There he is.
I don't think he's going through a little.
Dario, can you hear us? Can you mute and unmute, please? Thank you. Because we have a... No, we still have a very weird sound. We cannot... We know that you're speaking, but the sound is cartoonish. Can you disconnect and connect again? Can you disconnect and connect again, please? Thank you. That's the only hybrid panel during the conference, and of course, you know.
We were very concerned about it.
We were very concerned about it, and of course, you know, self-fulfilling prophecy. Is that what it is?
So if you hadn't been concerned at all, it would
Yes,
have...
then it would be perfect.
But we had a number of people who were willing to participate virtually, but we decided it's too risky, especially on the panel debates. So that's why we took the chance on this particular one. If it is too complex, I know Dario's argument because I'm also involved in the project.
But we knew that already.
Yeah.
Hello, Dario.
Now,
Dario, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Wonderful.
Myself,
Perfect.
I can't see you now. Anyway, can I start?
yes.
Yes.
Well, now it's better. I can see. Oh, I can see Chris. Hi. All right. Okay. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very sorry not to be there. Unfortunately, I had a commitment here in the UK, and I couldn't leave. I also, of course, am not part of this project, Horizon project on the differentiation, domination, and democracy. So I would have liked to be there to learn a bit more of what we have been doing. And mainly because John Erik's suggestions, I'm trying to connect, in a sense, a project on which some of us, you know, John Erik, Magda, I, and other institutions have just started another Horizon project, and which is in some way mainly on issues of representation, as John Erik had just mentioned. And in a sense, it seems to me that it's always great to have different kind of projects, one following each other and learning from each other. I always think that the best thing that the European Union has done from the academic point of view is to put money to create a kind of a European-wide community of researchers. The only problem is that they've put all those kind of conditionality in terms of applications and different kind of bureaucratic things. But if when we just meet each other, we try to learn quite a lot. So I think that's the important thing. So anyway, what I want to do today, in a way, is to build up a bit about the issue of democracy in the EU, but look very much from the point of representation. And in a sense, I suppose, as the EUR project has been doing, has been looking at this issue from the two aspects of differentiation, of what it means to differentiation in the kind of polity in the making, I would say, of the European Union. It's always in the making, in a sense. And then what also means in terms of possibility of creating opportunity, democratic opportunity, or also this process of differentiation may create kind of conditions of dominance. Now, I think that we have been obsessed in the European academic and non-academic discussion about democracy with the question of deficit. And we have been obsessed with this issue for many years. I still think that this is the kind of wrong metaphor. Many years ago, Neil McCormick suggests that, of course, a deficit can be considered in terms of luck, but this is not what perhaps should be more appropriate to discuss about the European Union. The deficit should be instead considered more, or the issue of democracy should be more considered in terms of the appropriate level of democracy that is required for the kind of polity that the European Union is or is becoming. From this point of view, the question of deficit does not really apply. What applies is a discussion both in terms of how we consider, or different way of considering the European Union, and how we consider democracy. I think that one important, and we discussed this issue about democratic deficit in many ways, if you, of course, together in some cases, and also with other people in the European kind of academic community at large, or also outside, in terms of constitutional issues, in terms of citizenship issues, and so on and so forth. I think that we've also discussed in terms of the more...
We lost him. We can't hear you, Dario. Are you there now, Dario? No. Should he reconnect again, or can you reconnect again? He's back. No, he went out and he's coming back in again.
I think it's an issue with the local connection.
The wire. This redirect project is starting now. Well, it started in February, and it is run from Siena. And it combines a more theoretical approach on representation with quite extensive survey and other types of methods to understand, because we're looking not only at the deliberative dimension of representation, but also the effective. So there will be quite a lot of attention to people and notions of trust also in the project. And that also dovetails with other projects that are also looking at issues of trust. And it has a kind of first a diagnostic element in terms of understanding to what extent there is a representative disconnect, and then also trying to find ways of reconnecting, but also redirecting efforts. So, I mean, looking at new forms of deliberative participation, citizen theories, and so on. So, to see, can you reconfigure democracy to make it work under different circumstances, but still maintaining the focus on still maintaining the focus on representation as a systemic aspect. And I hope Dario gets a chance to explain what he means by democratic, a representative system. Are you with us now, Dario? No.
No. Magda, should we move on to Stephen's presentation?
Okay, yes.
Is that okay, Stephen?
All right, yeah,
Yes.
sure, yeah,
Yes.
yeah, it's a shame, but yes.
Yes.
You
So,
can't only have the negatives, you need.
so they are working on getting you on board again, and Dario, and then.
I also have a PowerPoint, so
Oh.
I can just do the press, I can go without.
You're
No,
very brave.
just, I can also move down there and, so I can click if it's easier. Yeah.
But we can upload it.
Yeah.
Actually, this is also more logical in terms of EU3D, because we first try to find out about the relationship between differentiation and domination, and then to say, okay, to what extent can democracy bounce back? So, I'm afraid that academic life is also about patience. Induced.
And I'll go, I can be briefer too. How long do we
Whatever
have?
you like, whatever you like.
Where would
because
you
we just don't know what this
Yeah.
Dario's going to connect. We'll just do it in
Good.
your own way.
Well, hi everyone. My name is Stephen Klein. I'm at King's College London. I just want to first thank John Erik for the invitation, and it's lovely to see all of you. Like Dario, I wasn't part of the project, and so it's been fascinating already to hear about things you're doing. It's very inspirational. Also, I want to mention for how the project, and I think in general, one of the things that's very interesting and dynamic about a lot of these larger horizon projects is the way that they integrate normative political theory, social theory, and then empirical research as kind of three levels of analysis, which is something I think is kind of very necessary for political theory to move away from kind of pure normative theory on the one hand, or just kind of overly critical, negative social theoretic reflection on the other. And so, for example, taking differentiation both as a empirical category, but also as a socio-theoretic category, I just find that very useful. And so for my presentation, so I'm a political theorist, and with a side interest in the European Union. I've done a lot of work on theories of domination in political theory applied to phenomena like the welfare state, and also a little bit to things like the Eurozone crisis. And so I thought for my presentation, given that, again, I've not been intimately involved in the development of the project, I'll just speak a little bit about kind of concepts of domination within political theory and some of the ways those may apply to some of the debates that you're having. And so some of this, for those who are familiar with these debates, will not be new. In particular, the kind of concepts of agential and structural domination, I think, are fairly familiar from debates about, in political theory about domination, but also the way those get applied to the European Union. But hopefully this third category that I've been thinking about of reflexive domination will go in slightly new directions, and we can discuss further the implications of that potentially. And so again, for the sake of time, I'm going to not spend, I might go somewhat quickly or not spend too much time, but this is kind of the rough plan for my presentation. So just to say a little bit about how we might think about a concept like domination. What is that category supposed to pick out in the world? And what makes it distinctive from other concepts we might use, like injustice, for example? Why is this not democracy and injustice and differentiation? And then I'm going to talk about the kind of 3 levels of analysis of domination that I want to propose, which is building on prior work that I've done on the concept of domination. And then finally, just say something very speculative about ways that you might map this onto kind of the debate around differentiated integration. But that is venturing more out of my specific expertise, and so it's a slightly more speculative aspect. So what are we trying to do when we use the concept of domination? For me, I think of domination as a kind of a concept that points to a normative grammar that maps justifications of relations of power in society. And so in contrast with a category like justice, the concept of domination focuses us on power, agency, and social structures, rather than things like fair procedures or the fair distribution of goods. So when we talk about justice as a category, we typically focus on kind of whether outcomes from procedures are fair, or whether those procedures themselves kind of treat everyone equally. What I think is useful about the concept of domination is it focuses us on relationships of power that may be both within institutions and procedures, but also extend throughout society more broadly. And so as a result, the concept of domination tends to imply a social theory of power and a social theory of social structures. So alongside the kind of normative theory about when is a relationship between 2 agents justified, when is the power relationship justified, a theory of domination also implies a kind of implicit account of the nature of the power relationship we're talking about and the nature of the social structures that we're trying to apply it to. And so in the 3 concepts I'm going to talk about, that's kind of what I'm going to focus on. And so my proposal is we need to think about domination at the agential level, so where one agent kind of exercises some form of direct power over another, but also at the structural level, where there might not be agents exercising that power, but there's social structures that dominate people, and at the reflexive level. And by the reflexive level, I mean the level at which we hypothetically determine the ongoing norms, institutions, and structures of social interaction. So in debates about domination, I think agential domination is what we most typically focus on. And this has been most influentially formulated by the neo-Republican scholar Philip Pettit in his theory of republicanism and freedom as non-domination. And so Pettit argues that an agent A dominates B to the extent that A can intervene in B's choices at will. So the extent that an agent exercises uncontrolled power over another agent. Right? And so the paradigmatic example for Pettit is the master-slave relation, where the master can interfere at choice in the decisions of the other person. And I think the key conceptual building blocks for this are, in the first place, the distinction between arbitrary and non-arbitrary power. So one agent may not dominate, so an agent can exercise power over another agent but not dominate them if that power is in some ways non-arbitrary or under the control of agent B. And the second crucial distinction is between, this is kind of jargony now, what Pettit calls vitiative and invasive restrictions on freedom. So for Pettit, you're dominated if the master can intervene in your choices at will because there's a kind of agent that's doing that. You're not dominated, though, if you're a country who has to radically cut your budget because the bond markets are attacking the value of your currency. Because in that case, there's no individual agent who's exercising power over you. There's a social system that might be constraining your choices, but Pettit argues that's not an instance of domination because there's no individual agent you can pick out who's willfully intervening in your choices. So this points to, I think, one of the 2 limitations of this framework. So the second one, which is that often when we look at when we describe a system as characterized by domination, it can be very hard to pick out who that individual agent is that's intervening. So for example, many argue that under capitalism, workers are dominated by capitalists in certain ways. And this operates not because individual capitalists may have the power to intervene at will in the condition of workers, because workers are in a structural position where their choices and agency is systematically constrained because they're dependent on the market for their wages. So that's the first issue. The second issue, though, is because you're looking for agents, there's a tendency of the agential domination framework to posit states as a kind of corporate agent. So you see this very clearly in recent efforts to develop an intergovernmental normative theory of the EU, such as Richard Bellamy's work, right? So Bellamy who I think, I learn a lot from, and in some ways I think provides the best version of this model of mapping agential domination onto the European Union. He nonetheless has to assume that kind of, say, parliaments kind of represent a sovereign state. And so the goal is to have a relationship among parliaments or sovereign democratic states that's characterized by non-domination externally between those different states. And so he has to take the state as a kind of corporate entity, and so I would argue as a result can sometimes downplay relations of structural domination that cut across states, which is something I've told Richard in the past. And so these two concerns lead theorists of domination to turn to what's often called structural domination, which is where individuals as a member of a group are dominated because they exist within social structures that systematically disempower them without the existence of a single dominating agent. Now, it could be that structural and agential domination exist in reality often together, but you can analytically distinguish them. And so systemic or structural domination exists because social systems coordinate activities that can constitute a structure of domination by shaping people's preferences and options. So, for example, there's a question of whether bond markets may in some ways exercise a sort of domination over weaker or more vulnerable states who are more exposed to those markets, right? And again, it's not that any individual bond trader is exercising kind of willful control over the fate of a country, but nonetheless, you could say that the members of those societies are in a situation of structural domination because their choices and agency is systematically constrained by their unequal exposure to these sorts of social and systemic forces. Similarly, a lot of scholars within the domination literature analyze gender oppression as an instance of structural domination, because again, there might be circumstances in which no individual man exercises agential dominating power over a single female individual in a social structure, but nonetheless, the patterns of social behavior, the norms of social behavior, systematically constrain the agency of women in a way that they don't of men and empower men. And so in scaling this up to international organizations, we can see that member states could be dominated by differential dependence on some forms of structural, say, market processes. And then there also, though, might be structures of domination that cut across sovereign states that have to be analyzed in the context of international organizations. So this, I think, so far is kind of the endpoint of the current debates around domination as it's applied to the EU. So we typically get agential domination, which is kind of people like Bellamy and intergovernmental approaches. And then I would say for this project, structural domination becomes a much more crucial category because you're looking at how the patterns of institutions, norms, and so on associated with differentiation may structurally empower certain groups of states within the EU to kind of disproportionately shape outcomes vis-a-vis other members. Lastly, I want to suggest that we need a third category of domination to complement the other two, which I'm calling reflexive domination. Because I think one of the worries about structural domination that I and other scholars have is it tends to posit individuals as script followers of immutable social structures. And John Erik in his previous presentation talked a little bit about the institutional world. I think we need a more sophisticated theory of institutions within theories of domination. And we actually need to learn from historical institutionalists and other theories of institutional change to reflect on how domination operates. Because it might, I think there's another level through which domination operates. It's not just that social structures may empower certain individuals and so that their preferences are systematically preferred to others, but it may also enable certain groups or individuals to have a greater capacity in the long run to affect the norms and structures of interaction. So the processes of institutional change may themselves embody certain aspects of domination at the level of people's ability to kind of reflect on their existing social practices and change them. And I think this is particularly important in a kind of sui generis new form of international organization where questions of institutional change, institutional innovation strike me as very significant. So there's this question of what are the institutional locuses through which that institutional change is being proposed? And are there ways in which domination might manifest, not again, just in the way kind of existing institutions may structurally empower certain member states or certain relationships over others, but also in the way that institutional innovation occurs. And so last and most speculatively, as I mentioned, we can have this brief effort to map this onto different forms of differentiated integration. Again, with the important caveat that, of course, the point of this is not to say that all differentiated integration leads to domination. There might be cases in which it does. And so I think agential domination has been seen most clearly in kind of emergency governance powers, say in the Eurozone crisis. That's where it's been applied most directly. But we can also think about structural domination through, say, pattern constraints of markets and institutions that may result in differential exposure to certain market processes. And then also about changing levels at the forms of domination at the reflexive level. So in terms of where the locus of institutional reform is that becoming more or less formal? Who are the actors that can sort of steer the processes of institutional change, both within the EU as a whole, but in particular because I have done the most work on that, within the EMU and the post-Eurozone crisis kind of efforts to bring in new supervisory mechanisms. Does that show that some agents have more capacity to steer those institutional reform processes? But nonetheless, I hope that at least provides some mapping of different ways we can think about domination, and I look forward to your thoughts and questions.
Oh, we're going back to Dario.
Dario, can you hear us? Dario? Can you unmute? Let me see.
Okay, so we'll move on to questions to Stephen and to John. Yes, please.
I have a question for Stephen and 1.5 to both of them. So my question for Stephen, this is very helpful and very interesting. Thanks so very much. I thought you thought that through very clearly, and it's very inspiring what you've presented here. My question is, how clearly are the agential and the reflexive forms of domination actually to be distinguished, at least when you move over to the differentiation part, because you yourself refer to the emergency governance as well as the role of the Council and the Commission in installing reforms. So that sounds that they seem to be kind of close. And the other one, which is to both of you, is actually to John Erik. I think clearly for your question, whether they should be treated separately, I don't think so. They should be treated separately, and perhaps, and that's my question to the both of you, can you install the agency element of Stevens into your model by then combining it, for instance, by saying that in a world of law, certain actors act, and they should be acting according to a logic of appropriateness, which would then be your institutional world, and obviously they may also be constrained from sort of structural conditions from the in and the outside is the power and interest. So I'd just hear your thoughts on that one. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Okay, thank you very much for the questions. I'll try. I completely hear and agree with what you're saying, and I need to think more about it precisely. So maybe it's more about characterizing the sort of agency involved. So actually in my earlier work, I actually connected structural domination with reflexive power. So I said kind of, because reflexive agency, it's, the agency that you're thinking, there's a version of agency where you take the institutional constraints as given and sort of say, what can different agents do given those existing institutional constraints? And that's kind of what I think of as kind of short-term agency. But then in the long run, there's this question of, well, how over the time through not just acting directly, but people reflecting back on the conditions of their action, can they change those structures? And so I'm kind of implicitly drawing on sort of structuration theory and social theory that sort of says in the short term, structures make agents, in the long run, agents make structures. And so that's how I'm thinking about the connection. And so I'm not committed to the idea that these are kind of wholly distinct. In the real world, I think all three of these go together in all situations. It's more an analytic distinction, And it's about maybe different forms of agency. There's agency where you're sort of acting within the institutional constraints that are laid out. You can apply game theory, you can apply strategic actor theory. But then there's always this question of, well, how do the institutional constraints under which people operate over time get changed? And I think that's what's often missing in theories of domination, and maybe also, and that's where we actually have a lot to learn from, as I said, kind of historical institutionalism, but also sociological theories of agency.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think what also is the debate in this case, of course, is can you in the end actually trace this back to specific agents? You know, I mean, and I think that limits the undertaking too much actually, and it also the manipulation aspect and so on is to some extent cast too narrowly in terms of being under certain types of worldviews and so on that are conditioning on people. So I guess that's also the context that you are referring to in terms of reflexive domination. Now, to Dirk, yes, I agree that one should definitely be able to identify agents under all these different worlds. Like, for instance, in law you have actors, certainly, and there are clearly notions of what constitutes an appropriate role for legal actors, certainly, and that also goes to the basic grammar of law, actually. You know, so one thing is the understanding of what the role of a judge, for instance, entails. The other thing is that I was touching on is also that law has a certain grammar that is, in that sense, places limits on differentiation, and you have to justify exceptional aspects and so on as a sort of element of the system of law as a normative system in itself, from Fuller and Waldron and so on. I think that's one of the things that's interesting, and of course that gave impetus to the whole debate about differentiated integration. To what extent these types of deviations and so on can be in sync with the basic grammar of law. Now, on top of that also comes the normative aspect. Again, going back also to issues of agency, you know, that role conceptions also are normative prescriptions in terms of what is appropriate to act and how you can justify your actions in that sense. So I think Jonathan has written very nicely in a recent article on deinstitutionalization in terms of precisely also, as I understand, is also in terms of role conceptions, that what you see is that the role scripts you find in different types of organizational settings and so on are becoming modified and so on, so that you do get behavior in places, you know, that is inconsistent with what you expect from, for instance, legal tribunals. And in this country, there is a certain clearly a case of the Constitutional Tribunal being basically populated with apparatchiks that is incompatible with the basic grammar of law. So this constitutes a case of domination. So that works both at the level of agents, but it also works in a structural level, you know. So I think definitely inserting that. Was that enough, or did you want me to elaborate also any other? Okay.
Okay, yes, please. Oh, okay.
Albena
was first. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Stephen, I really welcome the introduction of the notion of reflexive domination. It has a heuristic capacity, especially relevant for this project, because if I understand it well, it captures what the logic of appropriateness does to agents, right? It can be empowering, or it can be, repressive. And therefore it relates to John Erik's rendition of institutions that embody this logic of appropriateness. So it's very good. But then when I'm thinking about the taxonomy that you introduce, we always need to be careful how that taxonomy directs our attention and what it excludes. And I'm worried about the three categories, mostly about the structural, because there is a tendency in social science, when we talk about structural domination, to reify structure. It's never clear what exact social structure we have in mind. So in my work, I mean, my last book on the critique of capitalism, in order to avoid that inadvertent reification, I propose to always speak about institutions with structuring effect. For instance, the institution of the private property of the means of production is having this domination effect, or the institution of the patriarchy with gender trouble. But then there is an entity we do not capture if we understand structures as these structuring institutions. And this is the systemic logic, for instance, the profit motive and what it does to our societies. And that is why for it I reserve the term systemic domination. So just to sign the bell of this danger of reification of structure as we speak about it. That's it.
Sure. Good. And yeah, and as you know, in my previous work, I also moved to this more systemic level through the category of abstract domination, and which is kind of connected. So we're on the same page, I feel like. I think, you know, although I guess I'm just less wary of the reifying structure worry, because for agents within those structures, they already feel reified. And so is it the social theorist reifying them, or is that actually the reality of what people are encountering, that they feel like these structures are kind of immutable forces? And then the worry, and this is where I think we would disagree more, is my worry is that if you make too much, if you privilege the systemic level too much, then it still seems very, the agential possibilities become very narrow in a certain way, because the argument then is unless you solve the systemic problem, then you can't really address the structural. And I'm a little bit more like, I would say, ecumenical in the sense I think we can sort of address different facets of domination somewhat independently, and that there might be trade-offs between doing that. So there might be cases where, for example, addressing certain forms of structural domination doesn't affect the systemic domination of profit, like, you know, saying we should stop discrimination in the labor market. But that's just a trade-off for me. So I agree with what you're saying, but I think I would just be a bit more like attentive to trade-offs rather than sort of I would worry about privileging any level. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an important intervention. I also like your focus on institutions. And of course, institutions are, on the one hand, specific organizations. And I think it's important to underline what an institution is in Selznick's terms, namely an organization where, that is behaving beyond the requirements, of the technical requirements of the task, so that there is a cultural aspect to this, and there's also a meaning aspect to this. But of course, institutions are also like marriage. They are carried by a whole multiplicity of organizations and legal provisions. So it's almost like an institutional order to some extent. So I mean, so it's in the aggregate. It's not necessarily a full system, but it can be pinned down to specifics, and I think that's a critical point. So that we don't, I mean, because there has been too much vague theorizing about capitalism and this sort of a dark force, you know. I mean, that's it doesn't take us anywhere, basically. So it always has to be pinned down to something, and the question is exactly what are we pinning it down to? And I think developing that type of vocabulary and also especially managing to try to prioritize this is a very, very important challenge in this sense. But it has to be pinned down. But I think to talk about structures is fundamental in this sense.
Thank you very much, John Erik and Stephen, for your presentations. So it seemed to me that the core of dominance is about reducing the legitimate discretion of an actor, so intervening against its will. I was wondering whether you could say something about the relationship between dominance and lack of accountability. So this keyword accountability, because John Erik knows that we recently also worked on a report on dominance in the European Council, and so it seemed to me that dominance and the lack of accountability are somehow the opposite dimension, but still the opposite of dominance is not only lack of accountability, but also something else. So I was wondering whether you have something to add on this. And if I have, if I may, a minor point perhaps. So formally our D in the project is dominance, but there's also an important literature that speaks of domination. So I was wondering, are they entirely synonyms, or?
Yeah, I changed the word.
Thank you very much.
Can I? Yeah, just a follow-up, just a sentence. Very quickly, because you thinking of the opposites to domination or dominance, I've used both interchangeably. I don't know if there is any distinction, but I always thought that the opposite to dominance is legitimacy. I think that's what, from also your presentation, it seems to confirm that. If you can speak on this.
Okay. Yes. Well, yeah, Tiziano, we had this interaction on this on the relationship between accountability and well, I mean, I've used dominance and domination interchangeably, so I'm guilty of of this, whatever confusion that creates. One could actually say that the dominance is illicit and by nature, and then domination is sort of a broad. But I think they all have a normative slant anyway, so it's very tricky to make that kind of distinction. On accountability, I think it's important to keep in mind that we're talking about both making an account and holding to account. And that might actually dovetail with what you are talking about in terms of reflexive domination. In that there has to be a compelling account for something then to be held accountable at least. So in that sense, there is clearly a tension between accountability and domination. I mean, you try to rein in domination by means of accountability. But accountability is not strong enough to work as a complete antidote to domination. It's closer to what Dario was saying: legitimacy, justice, and democracy. Democracy as non-domination, as Pettit is saying it, you know, or at least that you can have forms of domination or hierarchical power that are justified and that they can be, that they're not only accepted by people, this would be Weber's notion, but that they would also be justifiable or able to be justified in accordance to basic normative principles. So accountability is not strong enough to go there, because then I think these principles have to be part of the account in order to ensure that you have this as an antidote to domination. But accountability is a vehicle to get that and to counter domination, would be my take on it.
I mean, I don't have very much to add, because I see, I mean, again, I'm not knowing the specifics of your research project, but I see accountability as kind of part of the institutional mechanism toolkit for thinking about how do we counteract relations of domination, but it's not the only institutional mechanism. And also accountability is a very broad category. So it can range from, you know, central banks announcing why they're doing something to the ancient Athenians, you know, has scrutinies where if you were found to have violated your roles in office, you would be sentenced to death. And so there's a very broad range of so we'd also need much more to specify kind of what, you know, why do we care about accountability? So I see accountability a bit more as a descriptive concept, actually, that describes a certain set of institutional mechanisms, and then what form of accountability we want would need to be specified with the concept of domination. They don't. I mean, the only thing I will say about dominance and domination that is striking, that which I left out of my presentation, is, in my mind, there's more of a connection between dominance and hegemony as a category that also needs to be in here, maybe. Or like when I hear the term dominance, I sort of think of, is there some hegemon? And that's another category that somehow is, I feel like, lurking here that would need to, you know, there's a worry that you start having word games where you just kind of can interchange every category. But hegemony is also an interesting category, which I also see as slightly more descriptive, right? Because there could be positive hegemony as well as problematic forms of hegemony. Whereas I think domination is has more normative teeth. And I would just say, I think non-domination, in my mind, requires more than legitimacy, because it requires a more substantive set of preconditions. I think a lot of political systems can have legitimacy with domination, but that's my somewhat maybe idiosyncratic view of what legitimacy is about.
Dario. 10 minutes, not that, 10 minutes, 15 minutes or so. But we've got a long queue of questions first. We've got Jonathan, we've got Steve, we've got Bridget as well, and Chris. So, can we take those 4 questions? Or shall we start with 2 of them? Shall we start with Jonathan and Steve first?
Thank you. Something quick to both of you. I very much enjoyed, Stephen, your categorization of how we think about domination. Maybe one thing that came to mind also in the light of the other questions you've just received is whether we should think of this third element as a third element or as a synthetic perspective on the previous two. I guess whenever you're thinking in threes, those are at least options available to you. It seems to me that you're probably closer to advocating a synthetic perspective, comes back to structuration and some of the keywords you were using. I had a quick look at your written text and it seemed rather the other. In other words, that there might be contexts in which all three are present, but of course that would be a different way of thinking about it. And I wonder whether perhaps the better way of thinking about it is to think about it as a synthetic perspective on agency and structure, to avoid some of the kind of the challenges of separating it off from agency and structure. And Jon Erik, it's very interesting, lots to think about. Maybe just one cut at it. So one thing you emphasized early on is that we need to think about differentiation and awareness of classical theories of differentiation as they developed in social theory in the 20th century. And I mean, without being an expert on differentiation, it seems to me they're slightly different in a fundamental way. So the kind of the theories of differentiation that come out of Parsons, I assume, have to presuppose the system which is being differentiated. Whereas when we talk about differentiation in a context like the EU, we're often talking about territorial differentiation as opposed to functional differentiation, and that is exactly about the boundaries of the system, or bits being somehow marginalized from the system. So to what extent are they compatible perspectives? Could it be the case that to get functional differentiation, you have to have that kind of presupposed system, and the more you have territorial differentiation, the harder it is to have functional differentiation? Are they two kind of dimensions that can be going on at the same time, or is it perhaps the more we talk about the territorial differentiation that we might see in something like the EU, then in some ways the harder it can be to talk about the functional differentiation that these classical theories are getting at?
Yes, thank you. I have two questions, one for Jon Erik and one for Stephen. The question for Jon Erik is a follow-up to what Jonathan just said. I find it super interesting, Jon Erik, when you start with the differentiation as a general term for political systems. All political systems are differentiated. But then you go on and present the three worlds. And now my question is, are those three worlds part of these different types of differentiation? Are they in competition? Can they be combined? I have a very strong feeling that they cannot be combined because they are totally contradictory. When you take the worlds of institutions and the logic of appropriateness, and you say not acting according to a logic of appropriateness is a pathology, and when you compare that with the world of politics and interests, you definitely have something there that doesn't fit at all because they contradict themselves. And then so I would like to hear your thoughts about, is this complementary or an opposition? And my second question is very short to Stephen. I would like to hear your thoughts about the dynamic aspect of domination. You've mentioned that, and I think it is super important, in particular with regard to the work that I know about Pierre Bourdieu, who has introduced the distinction between dominated and dominance. And there is seemingly no possibility to get out of this construction that, some are dominant and some are dominated. And I think there is a much more dynamic aspect to that, and I would like to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Yes, I'll start with Jonathan. Yes, I think Parsons is, as a structural functionalist, that has its own limitations. So he's talking more about roles and functions. I'm drawing more on Roccan in that sense, who was looking at these different types of territorial functional aspects and so on. In that sense, it works for the European Union because it combines or includes territory as part of this type of dynamic. Roccan himself is looking at these macroscopic. He's using Parsons-Agil scheme basically to say something about the interaction of different law, territory, function, and culture basically. So that's how he's seeing it. So I think that model is broad enough to be able to include that. So then the question is, how do the different forms of differentiation interact basically? And that also dovetails with Sabine's question. And in identifying these as sort of worlds, I'm talking about different mixes of differentiated integration and differentiation in that sense. But I'm arguing that in order to understand the full challenges, you have to have sort of the more broader, deeper infrastructure of how territory is organized, how functions are, to what extent they are differentiated, as sort of the polity infrastructure. And then you are looking at, okay, how do you then, what are the implications then for forms of differentiated integration under each of these elements? And I agree with you. I thought that I would set these out as separate worlds because I don't think we can resolve or come up with a theory of differentiation that is attentive to domination and democracy without actually exploring how these different disciplines and theories actually would understand it. And then to ask for, okay, to what extent do we find overlaps, or can we find a common point of reference by which to try to combine these different vantage points? But they are different glasses. And I think it's important that we make clear that these are different glasses because they weigh in phenomena differently in that sense. And therefore the balance between the broader differentiation and differentiated integration is different. For instance, in principle at least, the intergovernmentalism would be much more attentive to differentiated integration in terms of asymmetries of power and so on. Whereas law, as I was hinting earlier, its gene code is much more limited in that sense.
Great questions on both, and I've been trying to formulate how best to respond. So Jonathan, so yes, I actually think you're right. I've been thinking about it. I like the push towards the Hegelian unity of my theory as opposed to like Weberian chaos. So I think I'm thinking back. So in my book, I kind of had this much more clear tripartite distinction, but I actually think the Republican theory fundamentally doesn't work. I think it's not a coherent theory of domination. I think it tends to collapse into structural domination. So maybe the opposition is, like you're saying, is coming because of this agency structure opposition. And in fact, they in some ways need to be collapsed together. That still leaves what Albina and I were talking about, this kind of systemic level or abstract level, and I'm not quite sure where that would come in, but maybe it's true that kind of the agential and the structural domination are a single theory, and so it is a kind of unity. So I like that. I think I want to agree, but that's then leaving aside maybe other forms of domination. And then the dynamism, yeah, and so that's exactly what I'm trying to think about. But of course, dynamism cuts both ways, because both dominators and dominated, I think there's a worry that theories of domination present both sides as kind of script followers and constrained by the institutions. So I'm interested kind of in dynamism on both sides. How are both actors in both domains kind of actively reproducing and recreating the contours of institutions, even as to some extent they're following scripts. But then the third term, which then I think needs to come in, is also like, where does the contingency come in? So what is it that creates those moments through which actors can redefine? And this again is where I find historical institutionalism, critical junctures, all that sort of stuff could actually be really useful to political theorists, because we tend to get, I think again, there's this binary. You either have people who are like really structural or really like unconstrained moments of agential rupture. And that's kind of how political theorists talk about it. And empirical social scientists actually have thought a lot about this. And again, this is kind of always my refrain, is like we could learn more in terms of how we construct our normative theories from those efforts.
So thank you both very much. Can I ask, and to complicate matters a little, John Erik, you've talked about law and institutions, but what about policy? What about policy making politics? So in other words, does it matter if it's regulatory, distributive, redistributive, constitutive? And how much are we reading in terms of domination in the EU from the script of the Eurozone crisis? And was domination in the Eurozone crisis, which was very evident, the power, was that because it was a differentiated regime or simply because it was a financial crisis? Because all of the studies of financial crises back to the 19th century tell us that you have creditors and debtors, and whenever you have creditors and debtors, the debtors have no power. They have a problem in the market and someone has to bail them out. So in other words, are we reading too much from the enormity of the Eurozone crisis and its impact on the EU into the discussion of domination in the EU? And whether or not it's because it's differentiated or simply because it was money.
Okay, does this work? Good. Question for both. First for John Erik. It's great that you introduced this concept of world of institutions in thinking about differentiation. I don't think we have done that so far quite enough. And I think it's actually the critical test of European integration if one starts thinking about differentiation along the lines of logics of appropriateness. So think about the key concept like marriage. If in most Western European countries, and there is, public opinion polls on this, there's data, Western European countries would be clearly thinking about much more of a flexible idea of what a marriage is, a union of two people who love each other, basically. Hungarians, Poles, Slovaks would be embracing a very different notion of what this is. And it would even be, embedded in the constitutions in these countries, especially in Hungary, a union of man and a woman, right? So this is at a level of, logic of appropriateness, as where you get a very fundamental conflict in terms of thinking about, what this political union could be, and how this could operate. So I think, I think this is an important. Maybe that's just a comment. It's not a question. It's just a comment. I think it's I think it's an inspiring way forward. So to Stephen, that's an interesting set of this typology of domination. I think is very useful. Now, when you're thinking about these as ideal types, what would be the ideal type counter strategies when it comes to agential, structural, or reflexive domination? Right? When you think about communist societies, you would have, the typical way forward there would be the so-called islands of positive deviation, right? You would act within existing frames, but in practice, you would be establishing, a lot of freedom within existing frames. Same thing that, by the way, Oskar Schindler has done in this town across the river in that little factory, right? Where, of course, they maintained the law in a way, but still were able to establish practices that had done the right thing rather than the legal thing, right? So.
It's a great. I actually would just say, we should talk more about that. That would be a great way to flesh out the typology, in fact, to sort of say more about what that might look like. So I don't really, I can sort of imagine certain answers, agential domination, maybe accountability, and these mechanisms are more important, but the other levels you might need to think more about these counter strategies, but I don't have an answer. It will be a very useful thought, though, to flesh it out. I don't know, I guess I wasn't sure who Bridget, your questions were directed to, but I was just going to say very quickly on the Eurozone crisis. I would just, I guess again, I'm not a European Union scholar, but it just strikes me that like spillover effects and critical juncture crises that have these huge institutional ramifications are kind of core to the, as I understand it, sort of major theories of functional, of European integration. So I would sort of say, rather than it's like, oh, we just look at the Eurozone crisis where it's really obvious, well, that's actually a case where you then have all these spillover effects into other new, and again, differentiated spillover effects through fiscal supervision, where you might see more evidence of that domination. So that would be my first kind of just response. And then the second response would just be like, money is really important. And so, that tends to be, if there's not, in many theories of domination, markets are often the main vehicle we look to, because that's what determines people's physical survival. And so we can talk about other softer regulatory domains within the European Union, but my sense is it's like there's a reason you see more teeth on the fiscal supervision than you do on the open method of coordination, these other domains, because the fiscal supervision mechanisms are where people, where the politics is much more intense. And so that is where you're more likely to see mechanisms of domination than in, I think, I hate it, but in other policy, or that would be a question of sort of how do you compare across policy domains?
Thanks. Thank you, Bridget. Very, very important questions. I think that, of course, the debate on domination in the EU certainly expand or took off with the financial crisis, because then the asymmetries were becoming very, very obvious, and actually people were assuming that the Eurozone was converging before this, and certainly then this didn't happen. I would say that this also exposed a design flaw in the structuring of the EU in terms of the relationship between monetary and fiscal union, and how that worked, and in that sense, it exposed also the so to speak, from the institutional perspective, the birthmark of the EU, namely that the EU was initially set up to pursue political objectives by, to a large extent, economic and institutional means. And you see that in the Schuman Declaration very clearly, the political objectives of consolidating peace, but the EU was barred from a broad repertoire of policy instruments and also access to resources, and yet still had to try to fulfill this kind of function. And therefore, we have seen a kind of path-dependent development and reliance on economic dynamics, but also intended to fulfill political goals. And I think that type of birthmark, that type of imprint on the EU has marked it since the inception, because there has been the unwillingness to put capacity to actually carry out the objectives properly. So that the constraints the member states placed, that made them complicit in this type of situation. This would be my take. So I think that there is a deeper structural element in the EU that was exacerbated with the financial crisis. Money indeed, but the organization of money would be my response to that as well. And the fact that the EU was made so vulnerable to financial markets. So what you get is, it's not the EU in any way intending to dominate. It was used by especially the strongest states as a vehicle due to the vulnerability in the Eurozone itself. So you have a very ironic situation of a particularly vulnerable system exerting dominance due to its weakness, not to its strength in some ways. So I think that's the sort of a twist. On domination, however, you also have the other dimension, namely citizens. And the fact that states are suppressing citizens, also, for instance, with asylum policy, and the distribution of refugees and so on, and the definition of people actually in terms for migrants versus asylum seekers. And countries like Denmark also blatantly violating international law in terms of the role of migrants. So I mean, you find this in a number of different states. So there are domination also at several levels, you know, and the financial impositions that hit the different groups in Greece, you know, it wasn't all the people, but it was certain groups of people that were particularly hit, you know. So you had these types of distributive consequences too. So I think that's one thing. And then you also have the shifting of gravity. I mean, with the financial crisis and these developments, you found, I mean, I do buy some of this new intergovernmentalism story that there was a shifting towards the European Council, even if also supranational bodies were strengthened, but the democratic controls were weakened. And in addition to that, with the European Council, which lives in the interstices between the international system and the domestic system, it imports international tensions and so on into the EU. It injects a kind of intergovernmental logic into the working of the other institutions. And to me, this is a virus that weakens the democratic credentials of the European Union. So, and the shifting of gravity to more informal aspects, and also, I mean, for very good reasons, to prevent deadlocks, also placing, for instance, the treaty, financial treaty in international law instead of actually embedding it in EU law and so on. These are elements that are opening scope for manipulation much more. So that so I think that there are other elements in this system also, partly due to weakness and lack or unwillingness to unleash adequate capacity to put the money where the mouth is, basically, especially among the member states. Could I just, yes. One more thing. You asked something also very, very important, Bridget, about policy. I think that is very interesting. And we should also be paying more attention to this wonderful book by Oren and Skowronek about the policy state and how policy, as you said, drives politics and also institutions. And in fact, this is something that I also extract from Jonathan on how the EU's strong focus on developing the market also is a kind of policy driving politics and constraining institutions. So I think that's a very important one. So it's an instrumentalization of institutions towards a rather specific political objective. And that is part of the story of segmentation that Josef and Jarle Trondal and me are working on. To understand that this is the logic, this sort of marketization logic feeds into the notion of the EU as a segmented political order. And again, this question of a more limited policy repertoire and so on. So I mean, yes, this is a very important dynamic that we need to place more emphasis on. We speak too much about institutions and not enough about policy and substance.
Let's try and go back to Dario.
Dario, can you hear us? Yes, can you speak?
Yes, yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, it's perfect.
Oh, right, okay, fine. I'm very sorry about this technical problem, but I think one reason more to give up on the hybrid format. Okay, sorry. So I will go straight, and I'm sorry that also in this has complicated your work there. I will go straight to my main point. As I said, as I tried to say before, the focus of what I want to say, as also we agreed with John Erik when we prepared this, was to focus on the importance of representation, and as an important aspect of an assessment of democracy within the European context in general. But also I think that it will capture both the two other themes of your project, domination and differentiation. Now, there are two kind of premises that which I think are important to consider, and that in some way we have been discussing as part of the new project on which it's called Redirect. And these are, one is a kind of a conception of representation. In what sense representation is important as a kind of system. And the second one is what is the nature, if you want, of the crisis of what we call the representative disconnect, which in some way applies to particularly European democracy, which here is meant both as at European level and the national level of the various European countries. Of course, it's easy to remind you that Article 10 of the Unified European Treaty suggests that the functioning of the Union is founded on representative democracy. So there is something important there to consider. We need therefore to understand more precisely what representation is. There is a misconception, I think, or at least there is a particular kind of interpretation of what representative democracy means, more narrowly at the institutional level. And in that respect, if we think about representative democracy and the representation in this particular sense, it seems to me that the way in which it is historically and functionally developed, particularly in the European context, is very much embedded in a certain conception, in a certain practice, also the nation state. So to talk about in some way the EU as a representative democracy would imply a lot of assumptions, which are, as you know, well contested. But if we start thinking in slightly different terms, I think there is a bit more a possibility of thinking of the EU as in some way functioning according to representative democracy. And that is precisely the kind of more systemic way. I mean, in the project itself, we have been talking about an ecology of representation rather than a system of representation. I think that is right for two reasons. The way in which we have been talking about a system of representation in general, as also has historically been developed in the constitutional democracies, it's not so much based on a precise institutional scheme. It's not therefore fixed as a system, but is much more open. And therefore, to use the expression perhaps an ecology representation may capture better this aspect. I'll explain it a bit more in a second, particularly for the relations between the formal and informal aspect of representation. But also because I think that what is important to reflect on is the open-ended nature of any kind of organization or democratic representation, as in some way has become part of the foundation of modern constitutional democracies. And therefore there is always a process of learning involved, which in some way may be restricted very often by conceiving a kind of the representation in democracy as a system, and therefore as something already well organized and well structured with a kind of clear internal structure. So, but the main issue, it seems to me, is that in many discussions about political representation and democratic representation, we have been in some way fixated on the dominant aspect. Of course, it's still a dominant aspect, which is the electoral process as the core of representation. I think that by starting considering the way in which the electoral process is only part of a much more general kind of development of relationships between the electors and the way of governing a society, and therefore other aspects which involve the way in which the electoral system is part of a broader system, institutional system, which also involve more informal and more social way of representing, but also involves a kind of the formation of a public sphere or a kind of instrument for the formation of public opinion, which involves both citizens and rulers. It seems to me that to capture better what we are talking about. So the first issue that in some way on which our project and I think also the way of thinking about the European Union and the way in which it relates to representative democracy is concerned, is precisely to widen up our idea of representation, of political representation, through considering as an interjunction of different kind of processes, and not simply focus on the electoral process, or the electoral process which in some way is a transmission of a certain kind of opinion or preferences that the electorate has towards the rulers or the parliament very often, or the government. So this is the first point. The second point is, if we think in those terms, what is normally considered in the general discussion at the moment as a kind of crisis of representation or democratic representation? I mean, this is not new, of course. There has been discussion about a crisis both for the party system, which can be considered at the center of political representation, democratic representation, but also the crisis of democratic representation since the 70s of the previous century. So it's a long process, but certainly in the last 20 years, this sense of crisis may have been much heightened. Now, what we have been talking at this level is what we have called the representative disconnect. And here again, I think there is to be some qualification to be made, because the disconnect can be thought, perhaps in a superficial way, as simply the inability of the citizens to convey their preferences or opinion, or these to be in some way acted upon by the governors, the rulers, the parliament, the governments, and so, or this kind of in some way the agents, the representatives. I think this is a kind of limited kind of way of thinking, because the process of representation involves various things. There is an expression that we find in Peter Mayer book, in the introduction of Peter Mayer book, in which he discussed about the hollowing out of democracy, ruling the void, which I think is quite interesting. And then I've been insisting on this expression in Peter Mayer's book, because I think it opens up a number of reflections that we can make. And he talks about the way in which parties in particular were at the center, been at the center, I suppose, of the modern form of democratic representation since after the Second World War, as a kind of zone of engagement. Now, the zone of engagement, I think it's interesting for two reasons. One is because it does not simply think of the system of representation as a transmission belt. It's more something which both the citizens and the rulers had to engage. But this zone of engagement is also conceived in two ways. One as a process, if you want, of interest formation and discussion of a dialogue, if you want, between the citizens and the rulers, but also as more specifically as identity formation. The zone of engagement in which representation, democratic representation consists in, and there may be different kind of institutions doing that, it's also the way in which citizens and rulers, in some way, they think about their own roles within this process, and they acquire also certain kind, they construct together sometimes certain kind of identities. I think this interpretation that I think is also in Peter Mayer's book of the zone of engagement captures what we would call the constructivist turn in representation theory. If we see it in this way, it seems to me that therefore the process of representation has to be thought in democratic representation, I would like to insist here, has to be thought in a different way, or the problem of representation has to be thought in a different way that is always kind of portrayed. Very often the problem of representation is conceptualized, or in some ways problematized, mainly as a problem of transmission. How to transmit the will, the opinion, the preferences, even the identities in some cases, in a more descriptive sense sometimes, of the citizens, or the electorate, the people. There are different ways of describing, of course, the represented, into the language and the activities of the representatives. I think this is only a partial problem, and actually perhaps is not the main problem of democratic representation. Because the way in which I think that democratic representation in the modern conception works, and by modern I think after, in some way, if you want, the revolutionary period, the 18th century, is by constructing unity. The question of political representation is that it has to be a process that arrives at decision-making. If you exclude decision-making from this process, you have only part of the process. And some of the constructivist analysis of political representation has insisted mainly on the process of claim-making. The process of claim-making is only part of what I think is democratic representation. Decision is important. But decision implies that we arrive at a point, at a moment, where we actually converge about an action, a decision, as a matter of fact. And therefore, it implies that the diversity of the different opinion, the different kind of preferences, in some way come to a point of unity. And therefore, I think that particularly if you think historically, theoretically, in terms of the Hobbesian contribution to the problem of representation, that is quite a central moment. Hobbes is not the only one, but I think he gives a kind of, it's a point of reference, important point of reference, if you want, intellectually, certainly in the Western kind of conceptual representation and the modern one. So I think that this element of unity, of course, it was in democratic representation, was also given by a kind of constitutional unity that the nation state, the ground of the nation state, represented. So I think that within the European Union, the kind of system or representation that I think applies both to the European level and the national level, this problem of unity is much more problematic. But at the same time, I think that what the expansion of the idea of representation, the practice of representation to a broader European level may allow, and that related more to your kind of research on differentiation, dominance, and democracy, is in some way the opportunity, in some way to address issues at the decision level that is more appropriate to some of the decision, where in some way there can be more dominance, but also there can be more opportunity to address issues precise to avoid dominance. So in some way, some way to conclude this short and perhaps a bit confused also because of technical issues intervention. What I would like to raise is precisely the fact that by thinking of the political representation, democratic representation, more as a system, but also more as a process that construct identities and construct levels at which we can arrive at decision and reconstruct a different kind of unity, we can in some way start thinking about the EU as functioning as a representative democracy in more meaningful terms. But we can think only if we don't exclude, if we only fix our sight on the European level as the institutional site for representation, we are missing the point. Because representation is more systemic and happens at different levels. And the importance of the nation state level still remains essential in the overall system of representation, of ecology representation of the European level. So these are my few reflections, which I hope they are not too confused and they can be useful for your discussion. Unfortunately, I will have to soon to leave because I will have to move on to another meeting in London soon. But it's what my contribution.
Thank you very much, Dario, and thank you for hanging on in there. Very quickly, we're very seriously out of time, but if we do have one or two quick questions for Dario. No? John Erik, yes.
Yeah, I think this was very appropriate, Dario, because I think it fits with what I was trying to hint at in terms of a differentiation configuration by saying that when you are talking about differentiation, you have to have a configuration that is compatible with the basics of system and ecology. And I totally agree, this must be multi-level. It must be embedded in the European setting. It must be embedded in multi-levels. We could even think about the regional level, as a sub-state also, as an element of part of the ecology, because there are 9,000 elected politicians at the regional level. They are also maintaining this idea of unity or this understanding of the role of representative. So I think that is also fundamental in this sense.
And you hope to be able to come to Warsaw soon. Warsaw to Kraków soon.
Thank you to our three panelists.
Thank you.
I would like to inform you that the lunch is served on the other side of the corridor, and we reconvene in an hour at 1 p.m.